Welcome to an emergency podcast from The Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And me, Rory Stewart.
And the reason I'm sure you are all aware is because of what's been happening in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, where President Nicolas Maduro was the subject, along with his wife, of a pretty remarkable military operation overseen from Mar-a-Lago in Florida by President Trump, who is certainly starting out the year very much in the style that we suggested he might when we spoke on the podcast on New Year's Day. Maduro has been in power for some time. He followed Hugo Chavez, who has been something in the thorn of the side of successive American administrations. Trump has been building up military options in the Caribbean. And frankly, as he said in a press conference he just finished now, Maduro knew that he was coming for him. I don't think he can have known he was coming last night. And one thing that was absolutely key to this was the element of absolute surprise. So, Rory, how surprised were you when you heard that Maduro was on his way to an American warship, from there to travel to a court in New York?
Well, I think astonished that he managed to catch him because Maduro has been expecting this to happen for months. As we've been reporting on the podcast, the US has massed an aircraft carrier, an enormous number of Marines, some of its top stealth fighters, all off the coast. In fact, you can almost see them in the Caribbean from the mountain next to Caracas. So Maduro has been expecting an American invasion, expecting an American abduction. And yet they managed to do it. And they did it with Americans wounded, but apparently no casualties. It looks as though the logistics of the operation is that the US seemed to have switched off electricity, or at least this is the early story about how they did this, took out the air defenses, flew in helicopters, including one man that we're told by the admiral overseeing the operation was 49 years old, which is an encouragement to me as I have my 53rd birthday today.
Happy birthday.
And thank you, and has extracted Maduro. The big question, of course, which we need to get into is this remotely legal? To which the answer is not. What does this mean for international relations around the world? And what's the future of Venezuela after the removal of Maduro? Where do you want to start with any of this?
Well, I think let's start with legality. And it's interesting Rory, you know America better than I do. What does PSA mean?
I don't know.
Well, JD Vance has put out a social media post saying PSA to all those who are saying this wasn't legal. I don't know what PSA means, but I'm saying please.
There's a terrible revelation. I'll have to look up on my phone. It's a revelation, obviously, of our complete tech incompetence.
Well, no, I think it means I'm guessing please stay away or please shut up.
Public service announcement.
Sorry, one of our team this week. Okay, public service announcement. Basically, he was saying, shut up if you think it's illegal, because it's not. Why? Their definition of legality in relation to this is that America, are under threat from a terrorist narco state and a cartel led by Maduro. Now, what a Supreme Court would say about that, I have no idea. Most of the international lawyers I've heard on the airwaves today have said there's no legal basis of this at all, because under the United Nations, you either have to have a resolution of the United Nations, well, that didn't happen, or there has to be a sense of an imminent threat. Now, the reason for this big military buildup, I guess, has been to indicate, to give a sense of some kind of threat. Otherwise, why are you sending your biggest aircraft carrier down there? But I think that is frankly for the birds. I think what this says, we've said this so many times in recent months, in particular when we were bringing the end of the year together, is that so far as Trump is concerned, the rules just don't count. There is no international law that he's going to kind of put this through the lens of. There has been no contact with the United Nations. There has been no sort of understanding that other voices might want to have a say before he does this.
And more fundamentally, for a US domestic audience, no consultation with Congress. So people would point out that President Bush, of course, went to war in Iraq without a UN resolution. But he did get a vote in Congress authorizing that intervention. Congress is feeling particularly bruised. You've got senators coming out saying they were effectively lied to. Congressional committees called in the administration and said, are you planning regime change? And were apparently told no regime change was planned. And Trump's and Rubio's defense of this in the press conference that you were watching appeared to be that they thought Congress was leaky and couldn't be relied upon to keep a secret.
Well, and the other thing that Rubio said was that because this was, and the operation, I think we should hand it to the American as a military operation. This was absolutely extraordinary. And Dan Kane, who's the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he did a presentation at the end of the press conference after we'd had Trump's kind of he's one of his weaves, which went from sort of, what happened to how bad Maduro is to how they're bringing down crime in New Orleans and all sorts of crazy stuff. Then Hexeth doing one of his kind of, pumping his chest, Fox News type things. But then Dan Kane did genuinely interesting presentation about how the preparation went. And the point he made was that they'd prepared for this, they'd rehearsed it. They obviously had somebody very, very close to Maduro. They knew where he was moving. They knew where he was planning to be. But they said that the weather was key, and they've been waiting for several days to do this. So I guess that's why they do have a point in saying the minute you start talking to anybody about this kind of thing, you've got to keep it reasonably tight. But no congressional authority, no international discussion or consultation. Keir Starmer's just done an interview with the BBC where he said he had no idea, hadn't had a discussion, and which, fair enough, you might expect that. But I think it goes to the heart of this that Donald Trump now thinks that when he says he's the leader of the free world, that is how he sees himself. He was and I think this goes back to, we had that discussion not long ago about the national security strategy. He mentioned it specifically. He mentioned the Monroe Doctrine specifically, this idea that the United States kind of owns that part of the world, owns that hemisphere. He even said at one point, some people are now calling it the Donroe Doctrine, bringing himself right into the heart of it. And this is what it feels like to me, is that they are basically saying, we do what we want here. And likewise, there was a question at the press conference just before we came on, where he was asked about Colombia, because and he has basically said that the Colombian guy, to use Trump's phrase, needs to watch his ass, because they're, in his words, flooding drugs into the United States as well. And he repeated that today. He said, he does need to watch his ass. He's also been talking about Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico and saying that, we've given her the chance to say, she says she runs Mexico, but actually the cartels run Mexico. So he's kind of indicating, do what we say now, and then maybe we won't get too aggressive with the rest of you.
Yeah. Well, let's hit the next thing, which is, of course, the problem here, which is Maduro was undoubtedly a profoundly unpleasant, evil man.
Mm-hmm.
Had he gone, most Venezuelans would have been really, really relieved. This is a guy that clearly lost the election, which we said in 2024. He's a guy associated with murdering and torturing opponents. He's taken the Venezuelan economy to a fifth of its former size. It's a recession of 80%. It was the wealthiest country in Latin America. It's now one of the very, very poorest. And we now have a situation in which there are maybe 8 million refugees outside the country, in which the oil infrastructure is destroyed, the water infrastructure is destroyed, the electricity is destroyed. It's a truly miserable place. And again, as we had these arguments around the toppling of Saddam Hussein, or Gaddafi, or indeed the Taliban in Afghanistan, we have to find a way of balancing three different things. Number one, is this an evil guy? Yeah, absolutely, he's an evil guy, and people are very, very relieved that he's gone. Number two, is this legal? Is this the right way to do it? I think our conclusion here is no, this isn't legal. In fact, all this stuff about this being a narco-terrorist threat to the United States, there's a very good report by Insight Crime going into this in a lot of detail. There's no doubt that senior figures in the operations and other forms of smuggling, but most of the cocaine in Europe, it's not a threat to the United States. Third final thing, I think the question is what then happens, and I think what's grossly irresponsible about this, as so often, is the question of the day after. And whatever at least with these other interventions, there was some attempts at planning. There were months of papers being put together. This really does feel as though he's standing up, making it up at a podium.
Well, on that very point, he was asked. I mean, we came on air just as the press conference was coming towards its conclusion, but up until that point, virtually every single question was, "What do you mean you're going to run it? How long are you going to run it for? Who's going to run it?" And he basically said, "Well, these guys standing behind me." Well, that was Pete Hegseth, the Secretary for War, Marco Rubio, the Foreign Secretary. I think it was Ratcliffe who was there, the head of the CIA. Stephen Miller, your friend who makes those wonderful speeches that draw on Goebbels, and this guy, Dan Kane. They're not going to be sitting in Caracas, sort of, organizing the public infrastructure and so forth. The other thing that came through loud and clear, and actually Rubio said something very, very interesting. Rubio, I think, was allowed to speak because Hegseth had been allowed to speak. These guys, like, they've got egos. But he didn't have a script. And so he just went up and did this kind of rather rumpty-tumpty, you got to understand, you're now dealing with a president. When he says something, he means it, and what have you, and doing the usual sort of praise of Trump. But I actually think that there was something in the way that he was describing Trump, which was essentially saying, take this guy at his word. And when he said that and said, so we've been going after Maduro, I was sitting there thinking, I wonder what Mark Carney and Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, is thinking if they're sitting watching this now. Because they basically kept saying, no, America is the only military power that can do this kind of thing. We are the greatest country in the world. Anybody who threatens us in any way, anywhere in the world, we're going to go after them. Now, that was a pretty heavy message.
Well, on that, let's look at the day after problem. So this is not Panama. The most optimistic scenario when people are talking, they talk about the removal by George Bush Sr. of the general in Panama. But Panama as 1989.
By the way, Rory, that was exactly the same day. It was January the 3rd. When Noriega got
my birthday again and again.
I know.
Always happens on my birthday. Yeah, always happens on my birthday. So Noriega is the optimistic scenario, which is the US got involved in Panama. They toppled the general, put in a new government, and broadly speaking, things worked out. I mean, Panamanians will say, wait a second, 300 people were killed, 27 Americans were killed. But in the great legacy of international catastrophes, Panama went pretty well comparatively. But Panama is tiny compared to Venezuela. 3 million people compared to 30 million people. Mm-hmm. There was a massive
8 million, as you say, who are living outside. Many of whom may want now to come back.
Panama had a massive military base, and of course, it was vital to U.S. national security interests because of the Panama Canal.
Yep.
And so this is a completely different context. There are no American boots on the ground. Trump says he's not worried about boots on the ground, but there aren't currently any boots on the ground. This is a country which has, as I say, gone through an 80% economic recession, where there's barely often electricity or water supply for 2-3 days in a week, where people are in such dire poverty, as you say, 8.5 million people have left. So now let's think about what Reconstruction is like. And the big story is going to be about the regime itself, which is still there. I mean, as you pointed out, the defense minister, Maduro's defense minister, has been on television attacking these strikes. Yep. The defense minister, the interior minister, the vice president, who reportedly is on their way to to Russia. All these people are still in place, right?
Well, so, is that? Wait a minute. The vice president on the way to Russia, is that just a kind of a fake news thing, or because Trump said, Rubio didn't say, but Trump said that Rubio had a conversation with her.
With Duarte Rodriguez,
with the vice president, and then the other thing is that one of the names that's been added to the indictment. This is a rolled over indictment because there was an indictment against Maduro in 2020, narco terrorism, cocaine, guns, etc. One of the names that's been added is actually the very, very powerful interior minister. And also Maduro's wife and son. So I'd be very, very surprised if she's on her way to Russia. Anyway, on verra.
Let's see. And just to sort of, I mean, to give people a little bit of a glimpse behind the scenes of how we're trying to pull this podcast together and who we've been talking to, I've been talking quite a lot to Andres Velasco, who was the finance minister of Chile.
Yeah.
I've been talking to Michael Reed, who was the economist correspondent in Latin America. I've been reading a lot by a man called Javier Corrales, who's from Amherst, who has done an amazing analysis of the regime. And I on that latter point, the military is the key here. So there is something like, multiples more generals compared to the average soldier in Venezuela compared to anywhere else on earth, like 20 times as many generals as you would expect. And every general has a monopoly somewhere in the economy. They control the economy. They control the ports, they control mining, they control oil, as well as doing illegal stuff. The judiciary is also tied in. So Maduro had also corrupted the judiciary, which is one of the reasons why when he stole that election, the judges still voted for him. Yeah. So the first question is, what are all these senior people, interior minister, defense minister, and all these generals who actually run the country? What are they going to make of what's happened? Let's say the Nobel Prize winning leader appears and says, okay, I'm coming in and I'm going to bring...
Maria Corina Machado.
Absolutely. Machado comes in and she says, I'm going to bring transitional justice. I'm going to prosecute people who are connected with the Maduro regime, only at the very top. I won't go down, but at the top I'll go this, right? They're going to be thinking, hold a second. I own a large mining concession. I don't trust Donald Trump. I don't trust this amnesty. Why on earth am I going to take any risks on this at all? And it seems to me either they will try to cling on to power and do some kind of deal with Grenell, who's Trump's envoy, do some oil deal, in which case you have basically a regime even worse than Maduro's, run potentially by the former current defense minister. So, because Maduro is not like Stalin. He's not even like Saddam Hussein. This was not a personalist dictatorship. This was a big system, a Hugo Chavez system. And Maduro was a relatively kind of introverted figure who rose up within this big system. So just taking him out doesn't remove the structure of the whole state.
And just on that, you see, I think Chavez, whatever people think about him, and like Maduro, terrible man and used power for its own ends, etc., etc. But he did genuinely have a kind of charisma and a force and a power and a personality. Maduro didn't have that in the same way. And one of the reasons I think he was put there in the first place is precisely because of that. Chavez, who was dying, like a lot of people when they're on the way out, they don't really want to be followed necessarily by somebody who's, going to immediately take over and be absolutely brilliant. So Maduro, as you say, is the leader of, and this is where the Americans do have a point, he is the leader of a pretty criminal organization where he's got hold of the government and he's kept hold of the government and he uses it for his own ends and his own power. And this guy, Diosdado Cabello, who's the one who's been added to the indictment, he is like his really big enforcer, his right-hand guy. Now, all of these people, his vice president, the defense minister, the interior minister, they've all been on the airwaves basically saying, this is outrageous. America is an empire out of control. People need to take to the streets in defense of us. They've got these things called collectivos, which are these sort of, civilian groups that go around and keep control. They're now out on the streets basically saying, you do not come out and celebrate this. Leave the celebrations to those that are happening in Chile, where they're being organized to say, this is marvelous because the new president's friend in the White House is doing this great thing. And then the other thing which I think lends itself to your theory, they're slightly making this up as they go along, military success notwithstanding, is that Trump looked genuinely surprised by some of these questions coming at him. So then to sort of say these guys are going to run it basically means these guys are now going to start to work out how it might be run. And the other thing he did, Rory, he said that, and this may be clever, I don't know, he kept talking about there was a second wave ready to go. He talked about, and we keep saying you've got to think of him as a kind of TV presenter. He actually said in an earlier interview today, I was watching it like the most amazing TV show. I was watching it as it was happening. These guys were moving so fast. And then he said at the press conference, you guys are probably never going to get to see what I saw last night. It was amazing, right? But he then said we had a second wave of attacks ready to go. And he was very explicit that, I think, when I say explicit, the message he was putting out to these people, you know, Delcy Rodriguez and her brother who runs the parliament and all this stuff, was unless you come on board, you are going to be hit by the second wave. I think that's what he was saying. And meanwhile, the other thing I think we should probably talk about, Rory, is how other international leaders are meant to react to this. Because what happens now, if let's just say that the Venezuelan military don't cave, that these Venezuelans who are part of Maduro's clique and who are up to their neck in no good as well, that they just decide to assume power and take power. She gets sworn in as the president because that's the way the Constitution works, and on they go. If that happens, then Trump has signaled, and Rubio says take him at his word, then the second wave comes. Surely now the only thing that might even begin to stop that is if world leaders somehow coalesce to say, hold on, Donald, is this really, really, really sensible? And there is very, very, very little sign of that.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, the real key here is Latin America itself. So when he stole the election first time, 2024, or most blatantly stole the election, the Biden administration signaled very, very strongly to Mexico, Brazil, Colombia that they were not going to intervene. They weren't going to topple him. But if Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia did it, Biden's administration would be standing behind them with financial support and all forms of Reconstruction support. And Biden, in fact, recognized the guy that won the election as the proper leader of Venezuela. And nobody actually did anything. In fact, Brazil is rather interesting here. Lula, who's now out there saying this is absolutely terrible, this is a challenge to international law and state sovereignty, is the same Lula, of course, who turned up to visit Putin and watched his big military parades and hasn't called him out for the invasion of Ukraine. Right? So there's a lot of weird double talk here. But it has to be ultimately not Britain, but Latin America that decides how to come behind this and what to do. I don't think they're going to want to put troops in on the ground. I think very, very unlikely that Brazil or Mexico or Colombia is going to want to put in troops. Argentina, maybe he could try to lean on Milei, but it's the last thing that Milei feels that he can afford to do, I would have thought, at the moment. So then we get to the question of all this stuff that has been talked about again and again. People have obviously been talking about regime change in Venezuela for more than a decade. So there are all these think tank papers. We can put in the links if people are interested. I've looked at 10 of them, right, all the way from Brookings to AEI, War Games, etc. And they keep coming back to the stuff that will be very familiar to you and to listeners who remember this stuff from the Balkans and Iraq and Afghanistan, which is, firstly, you need to think about what do you do about the former regime elements, right? So in Iraq, those were the Ba'ath Party. You know, how many of them do you prosecute? Well, if you prosecute too many and sack too many, then you have a massive resistance movement moving against you. If, on the other hand, you forgive them all and say it's all great and you can all keep your mining concessions, 80% of the country says, what the hell is this? We didn't sign up for a revolution to have these corrupt generals keep 80% of the mining concessions. Secondly, what do you do with your colectivos, who you just mentioned? So we don't know, 200,000, 300,000 of these people who control all the food distribution. They're not in the jungle, they're in the barrios, they're in the urban centers, and they've been armed. They're paramilitary groups. So again, the story needs to be demobilization, disarming of these groups, guns to jobs. There's this horrible slogan, DDR. But in Colombia, you were doing it with 14,000 people. Here you're talking about doing it with 300,000 people. Now, again, people say Venezuela has all this oil, so we've got to get the economy going and that will pay for all this stuff. Well, Venezuela has got oil, but oil production is now about a fifth of what it was at its peak because basically there's been no investment in any of it. It's much worse than Iraq. You remember in Iraq, everybody was struggling 2003, 4, 5 to get the production up to 2 million barrels because it turned out that the whole thing was welded with rust. But in Venezuela, it seems, at least on the basis of professional energy economists, even worse. That sorting out the electricity system, the oil system, could take 5-10 years before you get decent revenue coming in.
But this was the other thing that, again, back to Rubio's point, take Trump at his word. If you remember, the time of Iraq, and there was a whole sort of thing run against George Bush. Oh, it's all about the oil. Okay. And Bush would be at pains to say, no, 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 it's not. Trump is very close to saying it's all about the oil. And he was basically saying that, he actually said at one point, I mean, it's pathetic. They've got all these reserves. It's pathetic how much they've been pumping. Well, of course, there is a sort of massive oil embargo against Venezuela, but they do have massive oil reserves. We said this on the podcast a few weeks ago, that America has been producing a lot of oil, but through fracking and the shale gas stuff, it's very, very thin, weedy oil, whereas Venezuela has lots of the black stuff. And what Trump was saying today is that American oil companies will go in there, they will help make Venezuela great again, they will help Venezuelans get rich. But of course, the oil companies, they're not going to do it because they're a charity, because they're not charities. So this is, I think he's been very, very clear that getting the Venezuelan oil industry working properly, presumably then, if they do manage to get some sort of governance going, then getting sanctions lifted, getting the embargo lifted, etc. But it seems that is such a big thing to try to do that unless you've actually planned that through, there's a lot that can go wrong along the way.
The big question, did you get a sense from the press conference who it is that they're proposing is going to be the government of Venezuela? I mean, is it going to be the Maduro regime without Maduro? Or are there going to be elections and then some new democratic government comes in? Because you could imagine the former, couldn't you? You could imagine Trump in full cynical realpolitik thinking, I don't care, I'll get rid of Maduro and I'll cut a deal with the next general in line. We'll put in the oil companies. Doesn't matter, it's an autocratic dictatorship, in which case you're just going from bad to worse.
I mean, a part of me was thinking that, I even had this weird thought that Donald Trump had actually persuaded the Nobel Prize Committee, listen, don't give it to me, give it to Maria Corina Machado, the Venezuelan opposition leader, because then she'll become such a powerful, legitimate force. But actually, I don't think she even came up in the press conference. And when he mentioned it earlier, it was quite sort of cool. He wasn't sort of, buying into it at all. And that's why I thought it was fascinating that he dropped in that Rubio had been talking to Delcy Rodriguez, who's the number two in the regime. So I think it's not impossible he'll try to cut some sort of deal with the sort of, those who are left of the Maduro regime. A couple of things, Rory, from our eagle-eyed listeners. Colin Jones has told us that Russia has denied the report that she's heading to Moscow. And then maybe there's another thing to hear that's worth us going into. Flame Basilisk 2533. Really interesting question. In legal terms, how does the US try foreign nationals in their courts? How do their laws apply? And can you explain the 2020 indictment? I mean, there is a precedent for this, of course. And this is, if I'd have been at the press conference, this is the question I think I would have asked. And that is Juan Orlando Hernandez. This is the president of Honduras, who was sentenced to 45 years in an American prison, in an American court, because of similar offenses, narco-terrorism, running drugs, as the elected head of a foreign government. And there was no...
after he stepped down, I think that the important thing is that he was not actually taken from his presidential palace while he was a serving president.
My point is, though, he was a foreign politician whose crimes conducted in his own country, because of the impact in America, an American court felt it had jurisdiction, and it didn't, and there was no question about that within the debate in the American system. So the Supreme Court would let him away with that. But the point, of course, the big point is that Donald Trump, who says this is all about drugs, and this is all about these terrible Latin American leaders bringing in drugs, this guy who got 45 years for doing exactly that, and what has Donald Trump done? He's pardoned him. So, I think the thing with Maduro, what is extraordinary about Trump, and you said when we did our kind of New Year's Day, and we were both sort of discussing, well, what might we be looking forward to in the year ahead? And you actually said, well, the thing to watch out for are the black swan moments, the things that we don't expect, but then suddenly they came along. Now, did any of us go to bed on January the 2nd thinking we were going to wake up on January 3rd and this has happened. And this, by the way, has been planned for months and months.
And this is also why your point about Rubio repeatedly saying Trump does what he says matters. Because, of course, we didn't go to bed thinking that. But equally, now that it's happened, we think, well, okay, we've been doing a lot of podcasts about this massive American buildup around Venezuela and the taking out of Venezuelan boats, and Trump making his normal ambiguous comments where he's frequently said his objective was to get rid of Maduro, and then sometimes he said it wasn't, and then sometimes it was, and back and forth, which is why Congress got them in and said, are you trying to do regime change? And was flatly told they weren't, and then they went ahead and did it. But that's exactly why one now needs to think about Trump saying, I'm going to help myself to Greenland, or Trump saying Canada should be part of the United States, or the Panama Canal is going to come back. And this is also relates to your reality TV point. I mean, what is Trump really trying to do? He's trying to make sure that he dominates the headlines every week, or ideally every day, with another spectacular operation. So if you really wanted to try to predict the next year, you could look at some of the things Trump says, but more than that, what you have to ask yourself every week is, if the only thing you care about is creating headlines and you don't care about international law, you don't care about consequences. I mean, let me just lean into that for a second. What he has done here, essentially to say, I don't like this regime and I don't like this leader, so I'm just toppling him, could be exactly done by China against Taiwan, could be done by Russia against Zelensky, presumably could be done by Europe against Belarus, could be done in Uganda, Congo, Chad, Niger. And there are very, very good reasons why we created an international system that didn't do that. One of them is protecting small countries against big, but there's another one which you'll be aware of. The one country I didn't mention, of course, is North Korea. Why don't we do it in North Korea? Because they have nukes. What do we create? A world that encourages everybody to develop these horrendous weapons, because the only protection they have from lawless activity by these sovereigns is to have nukes. Yeah.
By the way, Roy, just as I said to you that Donald Trump had said that Rubio had spoken to the Venezuelan vice president, the reason I was looking at my phone was because someone just messaged me that at that very moment, she was on Venezuelan television denouncing the whole thing as an absolute sort of scandal, and the Venezuelans must rise up against it. So I think the other thing, you mentioned their consequences. And the other thing we have to just calculate into this is this, that so Ukraine, let's just take Ukraine and Gaza. Yet again, over the kind of short break that we've had from this, yet again, we've had Trump having meetings at the out of which he announces we're very, very close to a peace deal in Ukraine. And then 2 days later, Netanyahu was at Mar-a-Lago and he said, we're days away from the second phase of the peace plan being implemented. And I think we're now probably going to add Venezuela to this. We're going to be days away from the new administration taking shape. Now, the danger of that, this goes back to what happened, say, in Libya, what happened in all sorts of places when governments have been toppled, is that any vacuum can get filled with any kind of badness and madness. And Venezuela is not without Maduro there. And by the way, I think he's a truly terrible human being, but the potential for instability is pretty enormous. So I think that the worry I have in this is that Trump has, I think that the psychology of this, he's clearly this has been on the cards for a long time, but I think a part of him just loves the idea of being at Mar-a-Lago. People think he's having a holiday, and guess what he's about to do. And then he does it, and then all around the world, every television screen in the world has got, we're sitting watching a blank screen waiting for Donald Trump to come and tell us what he's just done. And because that's what rocks his boat. Well, floats his boat.
I mean, yeah. So I think let's take that as the central insight into Trump, which is that it's about spectacular news creation. It's about reality TV. But there's a possibility that this is, for some time, almost the end of it. And we could have a repeat here of what we saw in Iran, which is that he sends in strikes. He makes great claims, and then he just leaves the regime in place, having hit it. So it's possible that what we'll see here is that he thinks he's done his job, taking out Maduro, hopes that the new generals will cut deals with American oil men, and all the hope from Venezuelans for a new chapter and a new democracy may turn out to be completely false, and Trump may not be trying to do boots on the ground. That's one possibility. Second possibility, which I think would be very, very strange, but he could be drawn into it, is that he actually does try to put boots on the ground, and America really does try to run Venezuela. That's certainly what he was talking about at the press conference. It makes no sense to me because everything he's ever said about international intervention around the world suggests the last thing he wants to do is that, but it's possible. Maybe the Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine is genuine American boots on the ground in its hemisphere and nowhere else. In which case, that is one of the most difficult things that you can take on. Now, here also I'm getting, when I talked to a couple of Venezuelans this morning, and I was getting real flashbacks to Iraq and Afghanistan, because of course the optimistic story is no. I remember when we went into Iraq, everyone was like, oh, this is not Afghanistan. This is a much more wealthy country. It's got amazing oil reserves. They'll make a lot of money. We're very educated people. And now, of course, the Venezuelans are saying, no, this is not Iraq. We're a very educated people. Ricardo Hausman is a Harvard professor. We've got this. It's not going to be easy, but a democratic transition, all these wonderful technocrats will come back. They'll rebuild the country. There's incredible revenue. This is it's not a primitive place. This is, it doesn't have religious problems or sectarian problems, right? So, but what I think is underestimated in this analysis is what 25 years of smashing up a state does. When people like Chavez and Maduro take your economy down by 80%, when nothing works in the infrastructure, where everything in the military and judiciary is completely hollowed out, where there's no civil society, where there's 200,000 people in a paramilitary with drugs, where FARC and the Colombia guerrillas are on the border, right? Come into that situation as an American administration, you're completely finished. But even as a Venezuelan administration, you have a problem, which is that you're coming in as a result of an American intervention. It's not like Ahmed al-Sharaa in Syria, who did it on his own, however much people hate him and however difficult that situation is, that was not an international intervention. He took that. This is a situation where whoever comes in will be accused of being an American puppet.
Yeah, there's a very interesting point here from Spring in Paris. Just for the record, it's unbelievable that one country just invades another country and captures the leader, and nobody really blinks an eye. I've got to say, Spring in Paris, I think a lot of eyes are being blinked at this. I don't think you can say this is just sort of happening. And what I think people are struggling to deal with is what can you actually do about it? Donald Trump has just managed to establish himself. Look at the way that it seems we can't have a discussion about how you might end the Ukraine war without Donald Trump being central to it. Where's the United Nations? I saw Antonio Guterres quote about this today, and it just felt bleak. It was like there was no power in it. Keir Starmer, when he was interviewed, asked about it, he basically started talking about, well, we will be, let's wait to find out what's happened. Let's get the details. That nobody wants to upset this guy because they know that he can turn on them. And so I go back to the point I made earlier. I honestly think if you're the Danish Prime Minister looking at this thing, oh Christ, if they can do this,
let me add to this.
Greenland's a piece of cake for them.
Let me add to this. Imagine you're Zelensky. How do you know there isn't a sealed indictment against Zelensky for institutional corruption and, goodness knows what within the Ukrainian state, where some secret part of the Department of Justice has prepared it under wraps? He's abducted, he's taken back, he's put on trial.
I'll tell you what, if I was Zelensky watching that press conference, what I would be thinking is, God, I wish they'd bring this level of military might and expertise to my side against Russia. Because, they keep saying they've got the most powerful military in the world. No other country on earth could have done this. But, when they want to, they can do it. And the fact is that in relation to Ukraine, I think, you were one of the first people to say this. And I think you're right that Trump is basically on Putin's side. And I think this plays into the thing we talked about in relation to Alexander Stubb, the president of Iceland, President of Finland had said about these three, the world moving into these three blocks. What America is saying in relation to the Western bloc, US led, is that when they say US led, they mean that. They mean they can lead anybody within their team, as it were. And when Hexeth was at the press conference, he went up. I mean, I find the guy ridiculous, and I think most American military people find him ridiculous. But he stood there and he basically said, what this is America first.
He's also, Trump is also a very lucky. That operation could have gone wrong in any number of ways. Remember, this is basically something that has completely haunted the US. I mean, what was the Bay of Pigs? The Bay of Pigs was an attempt by the CIA to topple Castro. You remember the helicopters crashing on the way in to free the hostages after the Iranian Revolution that brought down Carter.
He mentioned Trump couldn't stop himself from saying, think of all the operations that have gone under when I wasn't in power that have gone wrong. You're absolutely right. And of course, you say he's lucky. The trouble with luck like that is it then breeds hubris, and you then go and do the next thing, and stuff does go
100%, because we could have been talking today after a catastrophic operation in which helicopters had gone down, Delta Force personnel had been killed, and Maduro had not been captured. And now it may be that Trump just invents some new thing, some new war, and moves on, and it doesn't really affect him. I mean, it's interesting to try to work out how much of a risk he was aware he was taking, and whether he thought there were big downsides if it did go wrong.
That's why I think you have to look, regardless of what you think of him or Maduro, there will be films made decades from now about the military operation itself. It is an incredible thing that they did. I mean, Maduro must be one of the most protected people on earth. He knows he's at risk. He's got enemies inside. He's got enemies outside. The whole business of security. I mean, I've seen lots of leaders and the security that surrounds them. He would be right up there in the top league of protection. And yet somehow they penetrated it.
And not least, of course, the people that run his entire intelligence service are the Cuban intelligence.
Yeah.
And the one thing that Cuban intelligence has done since Castro took over is create an entire enterprise that existed for one purpose and one purpose only, which was stopping the Americans assassinating or abducting Castro. So, and they did it very, very effectively. And those are the guys that run Venezuelan intelligence. So it really is astonishing, and suggests very strongly that they had managed to penetrate right inside the core of Maduro's operation to be able to pull this off.
Yeah, the military guy, Dan Kane, he said, that we'd been working on intelligence, as we know, where he ate, what he ate, who he ate with, what pets he had. He was building this picture that they'd been sort of tracking him, but they couldn't have done that, given who he is and the extent to which he's protected. They could not have done that without somebody very, very, very close saying where he's going and what he's doing.
Now, this is then an issue for China, Russia, and others. So Venezuela was was one of their linchpin countries in Latin America. China made big loans to Venezuela. Russia, in particular, was cooperating with Venezuela in a whole series of things. There have been formal criticisms of it, but of course, as with Iran, yet again, Russia and China has demonstrated that they're not really willing to stand up for their allies. Now, Venezuela, was a source of oil. Iran was supplying Russia with all those drones in Ukraine, a lot of its transfer of technology, and yet Russia made no attempt really to stand up for it. So it does raise some very interesting questions about this kind of multipolar world, which is the US seems to be able to do these operations, and the other world powers are not really able to protect their proxies.
Yeah, and I can't quite work out what I think of the responses, because it was interesting going through some of the international responses. China talk about this being a breach of international law and reckless and dangerous and so forth. And Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, saying similar things, but they feel quite sotto voce to me. They don't feel like they're kind of really crying out for some sort of action to be taken against American relation to this. And the calls for the United Nations to convene or whatever. They're coming from Venezuela, but I've not seen much else apart from that.
Well, so let's imagine China then did decide that the time is ripe to do a strike against Taiwan. It's pretty difficult to understand how Trump could respond. If he were to send a US aircraft carrier from Guam or a couple of subs, they could be sunk relatively easily because you're very close to the Chinese mainland. China is a nuclear power. China has the ability to disrupt satellites and space. China is, in purchasing power parity terms, the largest economy in the world now. It's completely integrated into the global trading system. I mean, these strikes that Trump are doing at the moment is demonstrating his power against weak states like Venezuela, but at the same time, he's shedding allies and actually scaring a lot of its allies. As a lot of this conversation has been about the fact that, as you say, if you're Canada or Denmark, you're not very, or Ukraine, there's nothing in this that makes you very keen to create a closer alliance with the United States. I mean, and it also, there's an element of it, I mean, maybe this is me going too far here, but there's an element of it that just seems childish. When I see Hegseth and Vance celebrating this, they seem like children. It's as though they really don't want to talk about what the long-term consequences are. If you were to try to sit down and say, but what happens in 6 months' time to the Venezuelan military economy? You know, what are you going to do about these paramilitary groups? How are you going to do a transition? They'd just be like, why can't you celebrate? We took out a bad guy. And if you said this isn't legal, they would say, why can't you celebrate? We took out a bad guy.
Well, we talked a while back to Jim Hines, Democrat politician in the States, and he came out and he made some very measured comments, just saying, you know, we have to be clear, we're the United States, we should operate according to international law, da 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 da. And this was put to Trump when he phoned up Fox and Friends. And he just said, these are weak, Democrats are weak, stupid people. And we've had enough of weak, stupid people. And like I said, when I didn't know what PSA meant, public service announcement, J.D. Vance literally was celebrating. And he was also linking it very, very directly to he actually said, we can get back our stolen oil. Their claim has always been that when Venezuela nationalized the oil industries, they basically stole American oil infrastructure, which is why that gives them the right to say, we're going to send in the oil companies and they're going to clean up. It was a very weird press conference as well. I mean, this was like this is a massive moment. By the way, is that a full moon up there? I think it is.
Oh yeah, it's a beautiful full moon with us, and it's
amazing.
Cold, and we're both amazing, in Scotland, incidentally.
Well, yeah. So, but he was.
Although we are both off to somewhere quite exciting Monday.
We are. We're going to Moldova, and we're going to. And do you see the Daily Telegraph made Maya Sandu their overseas politician of the year. Anyway, he kept doing this thing where it's really worth watching just for the sort of psychology of it. I sometimes wonder what the nerves you must go through if you're working for Trump. He had a script. He was reading from a script. I think he got through the first sentence before he went off script and did one of his little sort of rambles and weaves. But he did one right in the middle of this thing where he was talking about these people are sending violence, terror, and subversion against us. He went on about Trender, the Trender Agnia gang, and he then we went through crime figures. Completely made up, by the way. I don't believe that crime in Louisiana is down to almost nothing, and likewise in New Orleans. He went through the crime figures for Memphis, Louisiana, New Orleans, Chicago, and they must be sitting there thinking, he has just announced one of the biggest things of his presidency, and certainly of his second term, and he's suddenly just wandering off into all these different areas. It was really quite mind-blowing to watch. And then I think they must have been very, very relieved when he brought it to an end. He also did say, by the way, about the oil thing, he said this was the largest theft of property in the history of our country. So that says to me they're setting things up so that their supporters will go along with anything that says the Americans just go in now and they do take over the Venezuelan oil industry, which is potentially a massive, massive industry. So there we are, Rory. Do you want to take some questions? Or do you want to go
I think
enjoy your birthday?
almost coming to the end. Rory Munro had a good one. He said, what would happen if Argentina tried to take the Falklands? So would Trump take the side of his new friend Javier Milei, or would he take the side of his older friend King Charles?
That presumably is Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah, absolutely. Or would he pose as a neutral arbitrator? It's all very complicated. There's a lot of history on both sides, and I've got to try to get them around a table here. Look, and then there's been some good stuff also coming in the talk. Thank you very much. People coming in saying, is this distracting from domestic American politics? Absolutely. I mean, this is a spectacular way of dealing with the fact that, in fact, in many ways, employment figures are not great, cost of living is not great, but you just pull off this sort of spectacular attack. But most of all, I think we're in a world where nobody, and maybe this is the way to end, we have no theory for this. We have no theory of international law for this. We have no theory of post-conflict reconstruction for this, because we can't even begin to see who's doing the post-conflict reconstruction, what they're trying to create. I mean, in Iraq or Afghanistan or the Balkans, at least it was still happening in the old liberal world order, where the idea was supposed to be elections, free market systems, and all this kind of malarkey, right? Who knows what the Trump vision for a future of Venezuela is, or what he's prepared to do to achieve it. And is it empire? I mean, is he interested in creating a new form of empire? Is he worried about the idea of empire? Is the idea is his legacy to take Greenland and maybe help himself to some territory in Latin America? And then how do Latin Americans respond? How do leftist governments respond? How do more right-wing governments respond? How do European governments respond? Is there a point beyond which Trump goes where finally Keir Starmer, Macron, Merz come out and say, you are no longer a democratic liberal leader? People are pointing out that he's now banned 10 people from entering the United States for criticizing him. Whereas the British government, which he's saying clamps down on free speech and isn't really a democracy.
Never ban anybody.
Never ban anyone.
Yeah. Well, I'm sort of having second thoughts about going to the World Cup. I don't particularly want to be turned away at the border, and I don't particularly want to be contributing anything to his economy right now. Anyway, we'll see near the time. I must say, Roy, I think that I'm glad that we did this. I'm sorry that we interrupted into your birthday. We've had a few comments pointing out. I mean, I should say that I'm in the kind of far north. I'm in the Scottish Highlands. Rory's a bit lower down. The Wi-Fi is a bit better up here, I think. I think you've got to go. You've got to go. Maybe you're not paid your bills.
It's Elon Musk. It's Starlink.
Bastard. By the way, you see the Chinese are they've started to go for Mr. Musk. I noticed about his Starlink use. Anyway, listen, I'm glad we did that, because I think it would have been a bit remiss on a day that something so potentially consequential. Well, it's very consequential for Venezuela, and it's very consequential, obviously, for Maduro. But I think this could have broader consequences that we'll be talking about for some time to come. But as you say, I will next see you in Moldova, a country I've never been to. So I'm very, very much looking forward to that. And we'll be interviewing the president, Maya Sandu, and we'll also be doing our normal podcast from there, which I suspect will be talking about Venezuela again.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for the happy birthday wishes. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.